Welcome back, everyone. Today we're going to be taking a deep dive that takes us back to the turn of the 20th century to the Pacific Northwest.
Oh, cool.
We're going to get ready for a story about crime, obviously, but also one that kind of delves into like justice and mental health.
Right.
And so we're going to explore the case of Martin Stickles.
Okay.
He was called the Kelso Killer, and he was a man who was executed for a series of murders despite some pretty serious questions about his mental state.
It's a fascinating case, really. I mean, even over a century later, it really makes you think about how we, you know, decide guilt and responsibility, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So you've got like an article from Wikipedia about Stickles and some historical documents. Let's just kind of paint a picture of this guy. Who was he?
Well, he was born in 1870,
Okay.
and he only lived till 1901. He was 30 years old when he died.
Wow.
Yeah. And he was convicted of killing 3 people in Cowlitz County, Washington.
Okay.
And the circumstances are anything but straightforward, shall we say.
Yeah. So even just reading about like his early life, it seems like there's a lot we don't know. It's like shrouded in mystery.
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
You're right. There's not a ton known about his childhood, but his mother described him as being like a sickly kid and prone to fits of anger. And she even used the term unnatural.
Unnatural.
Yeah.
To describe him.
I mean, unnatural is such a loaded term, too, especially back then.
Yeah.
Makes you wonder what they were really seeing.
Yeah, it does.
What was their understanding of mental illness like in the early 1900s?
It was really different, you know. It wasn't as, I guess, sophisticated as how we think about diagnosing and treating mental illness today.
Right, of course.
Yeah, like they use terms like, lunacy and insanity, and the treatments were pretty rudimentary,
I can imagine.
even cruel by today's standards, really.
Yeah, for
Yeah.
sure. So if somebody today was acting similarly to the way Stickles was acting then, we'd be evaluating them completely differently. Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
Today we'd have, forensic psychologists, psychiatrists, tons of tests and assessments. The legal system would mandate a really thorough evaluation.
Yeah.
And the findings would, absolutely inform how the case was handled.
Wow, so different. I mean, it really makes you think about how differently his case might have played out in a modern courtroom.
Yeah, for sure.
But before all the murders, he was living a pretty isolated life. He was a fisherman working on a scow, and I can't imagine that kind of isolation really helps somebody's mental state.
Yeah, no, it's definitely something to consider. That level of solitude and, the harshness of that life
Yeah.
definitely could have, made existing mental health issues worse.
Yeah.
Or, triggered new ones.
Yeah, for sure. So we have Stickles, this troubled, isolated guy.
Yeah.
Let's get into the murders. So his first victim was William Shanklin.
No.
He was a former neighbor. What happened?
Well, in November of 1899, Stickles shot Shanklin
Oh, wow.
right through a window while he was eating dinner in his cabin.
Oh, my gosh.
Yeah. It was brutal. And he didn't just shoot him. Stickles robbed the place after and then set it on fire. Seems like he's trying to cover his tracks.
Yeah. And it went unsolved, this murder, for a whole year. Can you imagine living in that community, just being terrified?
Yeah. I mean, think about it. You're in your house eating dinner and someone shoots you through the window. It's got to be terrifying,
Right.
right? Like, are you safe anywhere?
It's like the ultimate violation.
It is. The governor even offered a reward for info leading to an arrest. But nothing. Case went cold.
Wow.
Then, almost a year later, November 1900, Stickles strikes again.
And this time, it was a double homicide.
Yep. An elderly couple, Cornelius Knapp and his wife, were shot through a window
Oh, no.
right in their home they were having dinner to.
Oh, my gosh. Just like Shanklin.
Just like Shanklin. He robbed them too, though. He didn't burn the house this time.
So how'd they finally catch him? It's almost like he's taunting them at this point. It's creepy.
Yeah. This time, though, the investigation led right to Stickles. They brought him in for questioning, and at first, he denied everything. But they had some pretty solid evidence. They found items that had belonged to Shanklin,
Oh, wow.
like a watch and some keys, and they were Stickles stuff.
So he was busted.
Yeah. And when they confronted him with this proof, his story, well, it started to fall apart.
So is that when he confessed?
He did, but it was a weird confession.
Yeah.
He admitted to the murders, all 3 of them, but then he tried to blame a neighbor, a guy named Edward Pierce. Said Pierce was the one who pulled the trigger.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, that he was just an accomplice, lured in by promises of all the loot.
So he was trying to get out of it by saying he was just following orders. Did it work?
Oh, no, not at all. The evidence didn't back him up. The investigators were sure there was just one shooter, because of footprints at both scenes.
Yeah.
Plus, they could prove that Pierce wasn't even close to either of the crime scenes when the murders happened. Stickles' attempt to deflect blame. Total bust.
Wow. Sounds like he was trying anything to save his own neck.
Yeah.
But there's something that I find really strange, You said earlier that he was laughing during his confession. Why would he do that?
Well, that's one of the most puzzling things about this whole case. Here he is, admitting to these awful things, and he's laughing, like he's enjoying reliving it all.
That's disturbing.
It is. It's like he didn't get how serious it all was, or maybe he just didn't care. No remorse.
Yeah. Really hard to wrap your head around that, It's one of those things that makes this case so fascinating, I think. We're trying to understand someone who's operating outside of normal human emotion.
Exactly. It's bizarre. But, and this is going to sound strange, but while he's in jail, he has this religious experience.
Okay.
That really throws another wrench into things.
So he found God in prison, that kind of thing.
Well, yeah, kind of. So the Salvation Army came to the jail, held a service for the inmates.
Yeah.
Well, Stickles hears their message, and he seemingly has a genuine change of heart.
Wow.
He converts to Christianity and makes a full confession to the priests. This time, though, he admits he did it, that he alone was responsible.
So which one was it? A genuine conversion or just a calculated move to try and get people on his side before the trial? It's tough to know.
Isn't it? I mean, how do you reconcile this sudden embrace of faith with that earlier confession where he seems so cold and detached?
It's like two different people. Really strange.
It is, and that's where things get even more intriguing.
Okay, so we left off with Stickles converting to Christianity and then confessing everything to the priests.
Right, yeah, and it adds another layer to this whole story, It's already a puzzle, and then this happens.
It really does. And it makes you wonder, did this kind of internal conflict, this shift from being so detached to seeming remorseful, did that play a part in his trial?
It definitely did. His lawyers and family argued for leniency, saying that he wasn't mentally sound.
Okay.
They said he shouldn't be fully responsible for what he did.
So they were basically going for an insanity offense.
Exactly, yeah. They pointed to, his history of behaving erratically, what his mother said, the strange confession. They said it all added up to him not being in his right mind.
That makes sense. What did the prosecution say to that?
Well, they said he knew exactly what he was doing. They said he was just faking insanity so he wouldn't get the death penalty.
Oh, wow.
They painted him as, a calculating criminal, someone who planned and carried out these murders in cold blood.
Wow. So it must have been a pretty intense trial, huh?
Oh, it was. And it caught the public's attention big time. The papers were calling him the Kelso Killer, and everyone was debating, was he crazy or was he just a cold-blooded murderer?
Yeah, I bet. It sounds like one of those cases that just grabs everyone's attention, Did they, have experts come in and talk about his mental state?
Well, back then, expert testimony, especially for mental health, it was still a new thing. It wasn't like today where you have, forensic psychologists or really specific evaluations.
Yeah, right.
Back then, they didn't understand mental illness as well.
So it was a lot of opinions and not so much hard evidence.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And in the end, the jury didn't buy the insanity defense. They only talked it over for an hour, and then they found him guilty of all 3 murders.
An hour? That's really fast.
It is. It really shows you how people thought about mental illness back then. The jury didn't seem to care much about those claims.
Wow.
And they sentenced him to death, hanging.
Well, that brings us to, the execution. It didn't go well, right? You said it was botched.
Oh, yeah. January 25, 1901, they take Stickles to the gallows.
Yeah.
And, well, it just doesn't go as planned. They messed up the drop.
Oh, no.
It was horrible. I mean, really awful. He was seriously injured, and it took a lot longer for him to die. It was supposed to be quick, but...
Ugh. That's terrible. I mean, not just for Stickles, but for everyone who had to watch it, too.
It was gruesome, really hard to see. And back then, they'd done so many hangings, you'd think they'd have it down, but...
Yeah, you'd think so.
There was still room for mistakes. And for Stickles, well, that mistake made it a truly awful spectacle.
You mentioned before that the press was really into this case, Were they there for the execution, too?
Oh, yeah, they were all over it. And it started a whole new debate about the death penalty, Some papers said the way they did it was cruel.
Yeah.
It was unusual punishment, But others said he deserved it, that he did terrible things and no one should feel sorry for him.
Wow. So it seems like Even in the way it was carried out, the execution itself just brought up all these other issues.
Exactly. People had to face, like, the reality of what capital punishment meant, how brutal it was. It made them think about how we treat even the worst criminals, you know?
Hmm. It's really fascinating. So we've talked about the crimes, the trial, and the execution. But there's still one piece of the puzzle, right?
Oh, yeah, we can't forget about the veiled woman.
Right. At the funeral.
At the funeral.
I mean, it sounds like something out of like a spooky story, right?
It does.
Who was she and why was she there?
Well, that's the thing. No one knows. They never figured out who she was. For over 100 years, people have been trying to guess.
Wow.
Was she, a girlfriend,
Hmm?
family, or just someone who liked, creepy things?
It's crazy. I mean, we'll probably never know.
Probably not.
Hmm.
And that's what keeps these old mysteries alive. We get these little clues and we want to solve the puzzle, even though we might never have all the pieces.
It's like we're hardwired to try and understand, especially when it comes to stuff like this. Why would someone do such horrible things? It's like we're trying to make sense of the senseless.
Exactly. And with Stickles, it's even harder because we don't know for sure what was going on in his head.
All right, so we're back. And we've been talking about Martin Stickles, the Kelso Killer, and his story. The crimes, the trial, the messed up execution, and even that mysterious woman at the funeral. It's a lot to take in.
Yeah, definitely a lot to unpack there.
It really makes you think, though. What about, like, his legacy? Like, what impact did this whole thing have, and how do people remember it now, over 100 years later?
It's kind of surprising. Even though it was so long ago, people are still really interested in Stickles. Like in Cowlitz County, where it all happened, they have a whole exhibit about him at the Historical Society.
Wow, really?
Yeah, they have all these old documents and stuff, like even some of his things.
It's like almost like dark tourism or something, right? Like people are just drawn to these kind of creepy stories.
Yeah, I get that. I think it's that thing about human nature. People want to understand how someone could do such awful things. And Stickles, well, his case is full of these twists and turns and unanswered questions. It just draws people in.
Totally. And it's not just local either. I mean, there's books and articles about him, people talking about him online all the time. I've even heard other podcasts about him. Why do you think that is? Why do we still care so much about a guy who died over 100 years ago?
I mean, the crimes themselves were just so brutal. Shooting people through their windows while they're eating dinner, that's terrifying. It makes you feel like nowhere is safe.
Yeah, it really gets under your skin. Like, even though it was so long ago, you start thinking, what if that was me?
Right. And then there's Stickles himself. Was he really mentally ill, like his lawyers said? Or was he just evil, pretending to be crazy to get out of trouble? We'll never really know for sure.
It's true. It's like we have all these pieces of the puzzle, but we're missing some of the most important
And
ones.
don't forget that veiled woman at the funeral. Talk about a mystery.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Makes you wonder about all the secrets he might have taken to the grave with him. Who was she? What was their connection? We'll never know.
And that's the thing, isn't it? Even now, with all our technology and stuff, some things just stay hidden. I think those unanswered questions are part of what keep us coming back to these stories. We want to solve them, even if it's impossible.
It's like we're wired that way, right? We crave explanations, especially when it comes to like the dark side of human behavior. It's both fascinating and scary at the same time.
It is. And with Stickles, we also have to think about those bigger questions about mental illness and how the justice system works. Like, how do we decide when someone is responsible for their actions, especially if they might be mentally ill? It's a really tough question.
Yeah, no easy answers there. That's why I think this case is still so relevant today. We're still wrestling with those same questions.
Exactly. So, as we wrap up this deep dive, what would you say are the most important things to remember about Martin Stickles and his story?
Well, for me, it's a reminder that even though we're talking about something that happened over 100 years ago, it's not just some dusty old story. It's a real glimpse into the past, how people thought and what life was like back then. It's about the good and the bad.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. Stickles' story is a warning, a reminder that anyone is capable of darkness, no matter how normal they seem. But it's also a story about how we've learned more about mental health over time, and how we're still figuring out how to deal with those tough questions about justice and compassion.
That's a great point. And even after all this time, people are still thinking and talking about him. That's gotta mean something.
It does. I think Stickles' legacy is that he made people talk, made them debate, made them think about those hard questions. He reminds us that the past isn't really over. It still shapes who we are and how we see the world.
Well said. So, to everyone listening, thank you for joining us on this journey back in time. Keep exploring those historical true crime stories. You never know what you'll learn or what questions you'll start asking yourself. Until next time.